Thank you for joining us for the first Creating Connections panel of 2021. My name is Shanna Bowie. I am the Arts Center Program Manager here at Destiny, and I will be your host and facilitator this evening. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we live, work, and thrive on land that was once the home and under the stewardship of Indigenous Ohlone people. We acknowledge also that the colonies, economies, and societies raised up on these lands of this hemisphere were dependent on the brutally forced labor of enslaved Africans. We acknowledge with respect the ancestors and living elders of the Indigenous and Black diasporas, and acknowledge in solidarity our Black and Indigenous neighbors and kin with whom we are creating the future. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, said, "Racist policies are defined as any policy that leads to racial inequity." So the racial language in the policy doesn't matter, intent of the policymaker doesn't matter, even the consciousness of the policymaker doesn't matter. What matters is the fundamental outcomes. So when we talked about what our first discussion of 2021 should be, we decided to invite organizations and institutions to engage in critical dialogue about the concrete actions that they are taking to advance anti-racism and equity in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests last summer. For ourselves and for our guest panelists whom you're about to meet, we are asking, what are the substantive changes you've made in your workplaces? How do we stay accountable to our ideas through our actions? And together, we're going to look at the internal and external practices that has shifted as we examine our role in addressing issues of equity in our communities. So this is a really important talk, and I can't wait to get to it. But before we do, we're going to start just how we start everything at Destiny, with a little grounding. So what I'm going to ask all of our audience members out there on Facebook, here in the Zoom, wherever you may be, find yourself in a comfortable space, plant your feet on the ground, and we're going to take some deep breaths. And when you're feeling comfortable, close or lower your eyes. Focus on your breath. And as you breathe, I want us to imagine, what does an anti-racist world look like? What does a world where equity rules look like? And I want you to take a moment and not just think about what that looks like. Think about what that feels like in your body, in your mind, in your heart. And on the count of 3, we're going to inhale. 1, 2, 3. Inhale. And exhale. And if you're feeling comfortable, you're feeling ready, I want you to open your eyes. Get ready to engage. So I'm going to ask our panelists, our guests, to come on screen. And we're going to get started. Okay. So we have some amazing guests. I'm completely blown away by the panel that we have tonight. I frankly can't believe we were able to arrange this. But what I'm going to ask each panelist to do is to introduce yourself, your organization, and respond to the following question. What is the responsibility of our organizations to advance equity? Okay. And I am going to start, since we have two guests, I'm going to start with Rebecca Malion and Greg Stern from SF Jazz.
Thank you. First, thank you. I'm Greg Stern. I'm the CEO of SF Jazz, and I am grateful for you inviting me onto this panel. Thank you very much. Happy to be participating. To answer your question, what is the responsibility of our organization to advance equity? The responsibility is great, and one of the primary reasons it's great is because we, as a cultural organization, influence culture. So I think that the influence that we can have goes beyond our own organization, but in fact can spill into the influence of culture, and the artists that we present have a very significant voice, and therefore we can influence certainly our audiences and the culture in which they participate. But beyond that, SF Jazz has a unique responsibility and a very special responsibility to advance equity because of the type of art that we present. The art that we present, the music that we present is grounded in the Black American experience. Its origins are an African American and Afro-Caribbean experience, and therefore it is incumbent upon us to be even more mindful, to be even more disciplined and intentional in advancing equity. There are other constituencies who we serve, and I'd like to invite my colleague Rebecca Malion, who's the Director of Education at SF Jazz, to address that responsibility as well.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, everybody. And again, my gratitude to Destiny Arts for putting this together. As Greg mentioned, SF Jazz is an institution and organization that celebrates and uplifts Black American music and Black culture. And so in terms of the educational component to that, my mission as director of that particular department has always been to center Black, Indigenous people of color, not only as artists, but as educators and change makers, to reframe the pedagogy that has been sort of instilled in our institutions, in particular when we're working with young children, and decolonizing our pedagogy and thinking about ways, strategies that we can increase and sustain equity and access to the arts. Because one of the things we know to be true is that the access to the arts is inequitable in our societies. And so through intense community engagement and conversation in that exterior facing modality, it is really, really critical that we center those things. But also taking that mirror and looking inward, and what can we do as an organization internally to support and uplift our artists, our educators, our staff, to make sure that all voices are heard.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to toss it next to Johan Smith, who is joining us from the Oakland Public Library. So, like, not just a cultural institution, but also a public institution, an important cornerstone institution in Oakland. So, Johan, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Shanna. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation to be a part of the panel Advancing Equity Through Action. I'm Johan Smith. I'm a library aide at the Oakland Public Library, and I've been there for about 17 years. I'm looking forward to listening and learning from the panelists and others who join us in this event. I wanted to begin by just sharing a bit of context for my role representing the Oakland Public Library's racial equity team. First, to explain how we developed a letter to Oakland, what we do as a team to augment our efforts, and to describe the OPL Racial Equity Plan. The letter is finalized and it's on our website, while the Racial Equity Plan is still going through a few adjustments and staff feedback and improvements. So when the coronavirus occurred and changed our jobs, the killings occurred of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, we gathered to share our frustrations and to create a letter to Oakland. It is quite long, but I did want to just highlight the first two paragraphs and the last two paragraphs. So let me just read that for you. Dear Oakland, at this historic moment, a time of deep crisis in our community, the library's racial equity team recognizes the deep pain many are feeling. This pain is greatest in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. COVID-19 has disproportionate impacts on these communities with higher rates of contracting the disease, higher rates of death, and deeper economic pain. Black and Brown communities are being pushed to their absolute limits. The recent killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black communities are linked because they are both caused by systematic and institutional racism. One of the steps toward dismantling these systems of white supremacy is for those with power to understand and acknowledge what is happening and why. And then I'm going to skip down to the last two paragraphs. As a government agency, we're asking ourselves, how can we support those suffering the most? How can we seize this moment? Together in struggle, we will find our way forward. We need to learn, become more aware of our biases, and consider how inequity is materialized in our everyday lives. We must not only start conversations about race and racial equity, but keep thinking about how our actions can actively disrupt white supremacy in our profession and beyond. Let us be gentle with each other. We are all traumatized by recent events, some of us holding deep grief. Let us support each other, allow space for expressing the pain, and create opportunity for healing. Sincerely, the Oakland Public Library Racial Equity Team. So prior to the letter to Oakland, the team has existed for about 5 to 6 years. We've hosted and facilitated trainings on microaggressions, created quarterly resource lists for staff, and encouraged all staff, this is the most recent thing, encouraging all staff during this time period with the coronavirus to attend at least one of the city department's racial equity, advancing racial equity seminar series. And those series involve 4 different seminars, each one 2 to 4 hours in length. And each racial equity team member has to attend all 4 before they can be considered to be a member of the racial equity team. We currently have 8 to 10 members on our team. So last, I just wanted to focus in on the racial equity plan itself, providing a summary of the racial equity plan. It has 4 goals, and I was going to just highlight at least one objective in each goal so you kind of get a sense of the plan. So goal number 1 is Oakland Public Library operationalizes racial equity. The objectives that a few that I mentioned here are that we will provide ongoing training for all staff on racial equity issues, and that the budget for OPL reflects those concerns and issues. Goal 2 is Oakland Public Library patrons feel respected and treated with dignity in all OPL branches and locations. Objectives related to that are updating our behavior guidelines so that visitors feel they are treated equitably and feel comfortable when visiting any and all of our branches. And secondly, accessing added resources for staff such as mobile community mental health teams and restorative justice models to address any challenging situations that staff are dealing with in the branches. Goal 3 is the Oakland Public Library is an equitable employer, and staff at all levels represent the full diversity of the Oakland community. Objectives related to that are improving workplace culture so that staff are able to apply for future promotion positions, and making sure that culture is transparent and that the community is aware of the hiring process in order to fully apply for new employment opportunities. And last, goal 4 is that the Oakland Public Library programming will serve the needs and interests of Oakland BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities who are using and applying a racial equity lens for all programming decisions. Objectives related to that are offering support in using racial equity tools for site-specific program planning ideas such as book clubs, community story times, etc. And last, establishing a system-wide community engagement plan with feedback from the BIPOC communities about ways that the library can address their concerns and needs. Thanks.
Shanna.
Oh my gosh. So I really appreciate everything that you said, because the Oakland Public Library as a cultural entity and also as a city entity is very specific in its goals. And I really appreciate how laid out the plan is. I think for many of us, our organizations were in the visioning phases, thinking of these issues. So it's great to hear that Oakland Public Library has already had this committee going for more than 5 years. Yeah, that's really awesome. Simone, I'm going to toss it to you, joining us from Airbnb, which is completely different type of entity from most of the organizations here. So what is the responsibility of your organization to advance equity?
Yeah, I do. Well, first of all, hello, everyone. My name is Simone. I am in the customer experience organization at Airbnb, and I also co-lead the Black employee resource group called Black At. There's two of us that lead the global organization. And I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming from a radically different context. While I used to work in the community, I worked in youth development, foster care. I'm obviously in a world that is totally, in some ways removed from the reality of how most people live. And I do want to acknowledge that, like, I'm coming from a different perspective. There's a couple of things I want to say. One is that this is really my perspective as someone who is a steward of Black people in a very specific context, and also sort of like my personal opinion of where I'm coming from. We do have some goals as a company. So more specifically, there's a couple of things we're doing. Like one, diversity and belonging, as we call it, is a company-wide effort at Airbnb. And we have a large network of what we call Airfinity groups, or like employee resource groups. There's 19 of them. And they really started as a grassroots effort of people who really cared about these topics and wanted to create a community. And this really turned into like a call to action to a full-fledged diversity and belonging team. And we also have global diversity ambassadors who help support intersectional programming and ally engagement in their local offices. We also have organization-specific councils. I'm actually on the Diversity and Belonging Council for my organization as well. And so that's additional diversity and belonging efforts that we're engaging in. And that often allows us to coordinate and work with and influence the leadership very directly. So we tend to have senior directors and vice presidents that are directly connected to either an affinity group or a particular council. So it's the proximity to those leaders that allows us to have quite a bit of influence in terms of what the thought leadership is around these topics. Late last year, we released the goals around diversity and inclusion. So we're aiming for, by the end of 2025, 20% of our U.S. workforce to be underrepresented minorities. So that includes folks who self-identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latinx, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders. And so right now, I believe the last figure that was released, we're at about 12%, so it's a pretty ambitious goal. But it's really this idea that we want to represent the communities that we're a part of, and Airbnb sees itself and operates as a global community. And so it's really our ambition to get closer to representing that also. In terms of like my role as a co-lead of Black Ad, I see it as I have this intention to invest in Black people in my company and their development and creating opportunity in different spaces for community and respite and healing. And so, I think on one end, there's this opportunity to invest in education of the world around you and the people around you. And I certainly think that's part of it. But my primary focus is investing in Black people themselves and figuring out how to use my power and influence to do that. On a broader level, the way I think about like what do institutions or companies like Airbnb really need to do, I think of this as companies really need to take representation very seriously, not just in numbers, but in values and in culture and in interests. And my friend Carvel Wallace, he joined us for a fireside chat last year, and he said that companies are limited in their ability to genuinely change until Black people and people of color are in significant decision-making positions, and they are allowed to be themselves within those positions. So that is really to say that representation happens at all levels of the company, and this idea that Black culture and the influence of Black interests becomes mainstream, so that people are so comfortable with this idea that Black people as a group will represent their interests and represent the needs of their community, that we are able to shift the entire institution in a more equitable direction.
And so if I had to boil it down, I would say that it is our responsibility to create a business environment where we as Black people are able to realize our potential and our maximum impact without any interference.
Close the discussion, done, finished. No, no, I'm gonna toss it to Jesus. Jesus is joining us from Pixar Animation Studios, and we've been collaborating on some stuff. A lovely human being. I'm so glad you could be here.
The pleasure is all mine. Just thank you everyone for having me. Having recently just really started to dip my toe into what Destiny Arts is, I'm just really proud to be even associated with this community. What you all are doing is really impactful and just inspiring. So thank you for having me. And yes, my name is Jesus Martinez. I'm a producer and a department manager here at Pixar. You know, we're in the backyard of Destiny Arts. And yeah, just before I go into the spiel, piggybacking off of what Simone said, you know, there is a difference between diversity and inclusion, and that's why it's called diversity and inclusion. I think a lot of people think of diversity just numbers, like, all right, let's just get a certain percentage of people and everything's going to be fine after that. But the real work comes with inclusion, and do all these people with different perspectives and do all these different people feel as like they are a part of the company, like they have a say in the company, like they can influence the company. And that's where the hard work is, especially with organizations that have been around for decades, you know, where that wasn't at the forefront of anyone's mind, kind of reshifting the mindset of how all the processes within our organizations function. Like, where are the inequities, and where are we silencing people, or just like not really promoting safe spaces? And you know, specifically with Pixar, we influence the world. We influence how children see themselves, how people view the world, and what values we represent through storytelling. Our films have a reach throughout the entire planet. And that's just a lot of responsibility that I think we've been really careful about what values and what themes we represent in our stories. And I think it's our responsibility to continue to expand the realities that we represent. And I think our audiences should see themselves reflected in at least 1, 2, 3 of our films. And we also want to create empathy for and understanding for realities that might not be exactly like your own. And maybe you start to see yourself in a reality that's completely different, that you never would have thought, like, oh, that's kind of similar to my life. I think that's super important for the work that we do. And, you know, and that comes through access, opportunity. Who's telling the stories? Who's from the PA all the way to the director? And PA is a production assistant, kind of like an entry-level job at Pixar. To the people who are in the cafe, to the people who are working facilities, like it's all the perspective, because we're pretty inclusive when it comes to people being able to give notes on work in progress as films are being developed. The notes can come from anywhere in the company. So like you want those perspectives and the diversity of it, and you want people to feel included and heard. And yeah, and that comes through top down and bottom up and sideways. Like you want to empower people at all levels, and I think that's kind of the journey that we are on, and it is a journey. So and it feels like the events of this past summer were terrible, but they did kind of give it a shot of adrenaline of like, okay, we've been saying all these things, now let's really focus on it. So now let's take this moment and continue pushing. And I think that's what we're all fighting and trying to do at Pixar.
Okay, piggybacking off of that, what policies has your organization started, stopped, or continued in service of advancing anti-racism and equity? Like, for instance, at Destiny, when we were looking at our strategic plan over the summer and talking about things that we needed to address, we're about the development of young people. So we started a anti-racism task force that is a group of young people who are looking at Destiny's policies, both internally and externally. And they are advising us and also leading projects about that. And they are getting paid for that work as well. So we made it a budget line item. So what policies has your organization started, stopped, or continued? And how are you continuing to hold yourself accountable to those policies? And that is, anybody can take that.
I'll jump in if I might, and then I'll toss it over to Greg, because I think, first of all, what's been said by everyone on the panel is incredibly meaningful and inspiring to all of us, because we are in this journey, and in some cases, in SF Jazz's case, I think we're really at the beginning of this journey. As an organization that's been around for over 30 years, centering Black art, and yet our power structure and our hierarchical structure and dynamic is largely white male led. So looking inward to see what we need to do to reframe that paradigm is very important, to allow for Black, Indigenous, people of color voices to be centered. I can speak certainly to what the education department has done, and then I'll turn it over to Greg to kind of highlight a little bit more the organizational focus of what policies we're initiating. But the first thing is, again, that access and equity piece. So first of all, how do we remove barriers to access to our educational programs and our artistic programs? Well, providing free complimentary memberships to students and educators and their families. We have been engaged in trauma-informed and transgenerational trauma-informed practices in our teaching practices. I made it a point to bring on a number of artists, educators of color, and we are in the process right now of doing a deep reflection and a sort of redo of our pedagogy, as I mentioned earlier, looking at abolitionist framework, looking at, again, healing-centered practices as well that really reframe the power structure and the dynamics in public education and arts integration into that piece. So those were my priorities as a director of a department that went through a dramatic transformation, and in particular was we were empowered to be able to have these conversations, very frank conversations with one another for the first time. After, again, operating in the same modality for a while, suddenly here we are on the cusp of very, very powerful time in our lives, and being able to have open and frank conversations about what we could do as artists and educators to reframe that conversation so that the students are understanding this moment, and they're empowered to also use their own voices. I'll let Greg speak to what we've done as an organization, in particular the accountability piece, because I think that's certainly very critical.
Thank you, Rebecca. First, I would echo what Rebecca said, and that is we're just getting started. And, we need to make more progress, and we need to accelerate that progress. And I think acknowledgement of that is probably one of the most important things in first step. In terms of acknowledgement and concrete action, one of the things that we have done recently is post a statement of acknowledgement, which acknowledges past action, which acknowledges commitment and intent in promoting equity. And that's a statement which has been crafted internally, shared internally, and now shared externally as well on our website. I certainly encourage you all to look at that. In terms of policy, there is both a philosophical answer and a practical answer. Philosophically, it is changing a mindset and committing to expanding representation among staff, importantly, expanding representation among leadership, expanding representation among leadership when in the context of our board, and also in our audiences. And some of what Rebecca talked about reflects some of our efforts to do that. Now, let's be clear, we don't have any audiences live and in the beautiful venue that is behind Rebecca right now, because unfortunately we've been shut down, as many others have been, for almost a year now, and you know, for another at least probably 9 months. So that also puts constrictions certainly on hiring and things like that. But expanding representation across all of that. But we also have, again, on that beautiful stage, the opportunity to put forth the message and promote equity through our programming. That is something that we have done historically. It's something that we will continue to do. It's something that we did just about a year ago, and then represented that in a digital format, and something that we're doing on February 28th with a live Zoom panel on jazz and race, leveraging some of the talent that we have among our trustees, as well as some of the artists that we work with. Other specific actions, just to be very quick, before my arrival about 8 months ago, we formed a Race, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. That committee, we are very committed to hearing their voice and expanding their influence. With that committee, we have hired an external consultant. With that consultant, we have begun executive coaching. With that consultant, we are beginning the process of data collection so that we can put forth in an objective way exactly where do we stand in white supremacy, in anti-racist behavior, or racist behavior, in anti-Black behavior, so that it's out there and very clear and objective. I mentioned the internal and the public statement. And the final thing that I would say in response here is, again, a philosophical understanding that it's not about a racist incident that might have happened. It certainly is about that, but it really is much further than that. And it's a question of participation in a society that features white supremacy, that features systemic racism. And until we take dramatic and significant actions to change that, our participation in that society makes us complicit. So it's about being, you quoted Ibram X. Kendi, it's about being an anti-racist, both within our organization and the influence that we can have with our constituencies, both students, artists, and audiences.
Anybody else want to answer that question? I just also want to, I know that it's not a easy thing for organizations to engage in, right? This is a societal issue. So I want us to be as like open and candid as like, what are you still struggling with? You know, a big part of this is asking personally and as an organization, what are you willing to give up? What are you willing to let go of in order for other people and other voices to step in? So, you know, you can talk about like the things you're doing, but you know, I think what would also be helpful for like the folks who are in the chat and watching is they kind of, you know, everybody's struggling with this, and I think they want to hear the struggles as well as the strides.
Yeah, I can jump in here. You know, there's a lot happening at Pixar, and it's been happening well before last year. one of the bigger things that have happened is we've created kind of studio resource groups, and they're kind of, I don't want to call them affinity groups, but they're sort of like, we have one for like that's called the palette, and from there there's like a Black, a Latinx, an Asian, a Southwest Asian, and North African group. There is our green team that's focused on like climate change. There is LGBTQ. So there's a lot of groups that are creating spaces for people who have a particularly affinity to try to make change, or just to create a space where you can just kind of like let your hair down and be yourself, or create a safe space for conversation of like, hey, this happened. What do you think of this? Should I take this personally? Is it just, or should I like, let's talk it through. So that's one thing. And through that, those organizations, a lot of grassroots movements have started. So we have a fair amount of access to our leaders to sort of make recommendations, to say like, hey, that email went out and you kind of excluded people, or do you not see what we're seeing here? And we're all kind of working together to kind of bring awareness to issues that are important to us and to changes that we really want to make within the organization. And we're reaching out to the community a lot more. We're kind of this gated studio in the middle of Emeryville, and that hasn't sat right for a lot of people. And there's been a lot of effort to sort of change that and be more engaged and give more of our time to the many organizations that are around us. But to speak to what we struggle with, like I can keep going as to like all the things we're doing. Focus and prioritization. There's so many things that need the attention, the care, to make changes, to make real dents into kind of the inequities that exist within our company and outside of it. That it's like, what do we focus on to get the biggest bang for our buck, right? And it can change by the day depending on what's happening, or like, so it's really difficult to sort of like condense all the issues that we really want to take a look at and dive into. And the other thing is, like, with that comes fatigue. Like sometimes you do want to take the shortcut and just do what we've done always because it's really easy and we know how to do it and we know what the results are going to be. Or do I really want to be the squeaky wheel again, like saying like this happened, knock knock. So it takes a lot of energy to be on the receiving end of that, and to also be the person to give that to our leaders. So it's just it's tough, but with the communities that we've built, I think there's kind of energy and inspiration that we draw from each other to like, nope, today's a tough day, I'm gonna get you this time, or let's support each other, and like, no, we're on the right path, let's keep pushing. But you know, the struggle, it's real.
Shanna, I just wanted to add that for the Oakland Public Library, I think one of the issues with the pandemic that we're dealing with is, of course, the budget. And so that impacts our ability to kind of foresee how we will, how our programming will be, I guess, implied or a part of the overall process of all the different layers of the library. So I think that's one of the challenges we're going to be dealing with moving forward. I think one of the positives is that we have a structure of libraries and of the city department of Equity that is supportive and provides these great trainings on advancing racial academy seminars. Also, this goal or the racial equity plan that we have been working on over the last year, it's been supported through funding through the Cultivating Racial Equity Institute. So we've been a part of trainings that have helped us to focus in on creating the plan. And also those are trainings that include libraries from all over the state that are also dealing with these issues. So the synchronicity or the simultaneity that we're dealing with together is a positive in terms of holding us accountable in a variety of ways.
Yeah, one thing, yeah, like as a person of color, as a Black woman, I think I've always tried to work with organizations and do things in a way that advances equity. And it can be a little bit frustrating to have like everything kind of blow up in June, and then all of a sudden everybody's like, there's a problem. like, like we've all been dealing with this. We've all been working through this and working with this. So I feel like we're in a moment where there's a lot of energy and money being put towards these initiatives. But it's also kind of like, where was this before? why did it take, and not even why did it take, because these things have been happening for years, but what is it about this specific moment? So I was also going to add, like, because I know we have different industries represented here. So what direction do you see your industry or similar organizations moving in with regard to race and equity? You know, like what is changing, not just within your organization, but broadly?
I can start here. So when the US had its 2 weeks of wokeness, um, the first thing that Black Ad did was put together the allyship and activism guide. And really this came from two places. One was I was really concerned that everyone was going to ask the Black people how to fix the situation, and I didn't want want us to be in that position. And the second thing was that there was a larger discussion happening within Black At around, you know, when there are these violent videos of Black folks being murdered on camera, do we share them? Do we not share them? What responsibility do we have to share and consume this content? Or are we just traumatizing each other and sort of perpetuating something that's not that useful in advancing the cause? And there was a lot of discussion around it, and really like everybody had a different opinion of like what, you know, what really the purpose of those videos is. And so that's that's ultimately where the guide came from, because it was this idea that we wanted to frame the discussion of where to start, and that there's many different places that you can take your allyship and your activism. But I wanted to put the onus on everybody else outside of the Black community to really pursue this and educate themselves and learn more about the topic. And the guide traveled far and wide internally. Really didn't anticipate that that was going to happen. That just kind of just turned out that way. But I think the larger thing that's often not talked about is that we still have to be where the money and the power is. And the money and the power still sits in most instances, I think, in corporations, in government entities. And so if we want to advance our causes, and if we want to advance the cause of equity across the system and across institutions, we have to think about how we become really valuable partners to these corporations and institutions. It can't just be like staying stuck in this phase of diagnosis and giving them a long list of like, here's all the stuff that's wrong, and here's why you're terrible, and here's why you should be ashamed of yourself. But to think about like, how can we become a resource to be part of the conversation to create solutions, right? Because even the most well-meaning people sometimes don't know where to start, or maybe have this learned helplessness where they're just like, oh, but I just don't know what to do. And so I think that's where it's really important that we function as coalitions where we share interests, and that within the organizations where we can influence, that we become key partners to the leadership and to the folks making decisions, so that it's not just about doing the right thing from a moral perspective, but it's about actually doing what's best for the company. And diversity, and diversity in your client base, diversity in your approach, creativity and innovation in the way that you're solving problems is always going to make it better for everybody. And so I just want to make sure that we're also thinking about, like, what opportunity do we have to contribute to the solutions and not get stuck in this diagnosis of like all the problems.
Yeah, I can speak for like animation and the entertainment industry in general. Diversity is no longer an afterthought. You can tell when a show is trying to shoehorn in a character that does not fit in there before for diversity, right? So now I feel like at Pixar, and I know every other studio that I've heard and how they're operating it, it's central to the stories that we're trying to tell. It's the questions are saying like, whose story is this? Who's being centered? Who's being left out? And that's starting from inception of the idea, which I think is key. And kind of to piggyback off like what makes economic sense for the company. Well, you look at, in our case, like look at Coco, look at Soul, did amazing numbers. Well, Soul not so much in the box office because theaters are closed, but like Disney Plus went bonkers when it was released. And we had outreach, like Coco was the #1 animated film in China. Like who knew what that market was there? But like it just starts to make economic sense when you start telling different stories, different perspectives, and you're starting to center different kinds of people. You never know what kind of audiences you're going to reach. And I think that's just being that message is kind of being heard by all entertainment companies, and not just animation, but live action. I think that's something that's really starting to settle in. And yeah, like to be a Black or a POC creative right now is like, for the first time ever, I would say it's like it's a huge plus on your resume right now. And it's a shame that even has to be a plus. Like it should just like I wish you could just be a creative and not have to be labeled as a particular group or LGBTQ or whatever to kind of upsell or to kind of be more marketable. But that's definitely what's on the mind of the entertainment industry.
I wanted to also add that for myself, one of the first diversity trainings that I went through in the 90s, kind of focusing on the theme of advancing equity through action, the trainer talked about the idea of addressing racism from a three-pronged perspective, like a three-pronged paradigm. He said there's the personal, there's the interpersonal, and there's institutional. So for me, that's something that I've kind of kept in mind since then, that when things are struggling, there's things that I can do personally to listen and learn and move things forward. I can talk to friends and family members, and that's interpersonal. And then there's institutional, which makes a lot of difference as well. And so I think that looking at that paradigm helps me to focus in on the emphasis on advancing equity through action in a variety of different ways. I think also, as we're having this discussion, that there's, I think Simone mentioned the idea about collaborating being a positive as well. That's something I've been involved in for a long time, and it kind of allows you to kind of lessen all the pain and the grief and move forward in a different way. And I think also just to realize that this whole process, it's going to take time and it's not going to change overnight. So if you are committed to be committed in a sustained long-term way, That's the only way that any institutional change is going to happen. So to be aware of that and to address that and to move forward with that, I think is a way that we address this issue of advancing equity through a variety of different actions.
I'd love, oh, go ahead, Chana.
No, you're the panelist. You're the guest.
I just wanted to echo both what Johanna and Simone said in terms of the coalition building. I think is such a critical piece of the direction that we can move in as organizations and institutions. It really does take this community of conversation, and those conversations are difficult, and learning to sit in that discomfort is the phase where we are now, right? We are still at SF Jazz having and holding space for these conversations through the work through the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, and also our own internal reflection that we have to do as thought leaders, as creatives in all of our capacity, so that we can eventually walk the talk. Because it is incumbent upon us, especially in education, in the sphere of education, to make sure that we're providing that example to these students who are looking to us for not only for answers, but to find their space and their voice. So being able to give them the space to thrive in any way we can, I think, is incumbent upon us as coalition builders first. And we'll be able to get there, but it is going to be a long and difficult process, but we must do it.
I was thinking about there's also this dichotomy of there are things that need to happen now. There are things that are urgent that need to be addressed. And then there are things that are, like Johan said, happening over the long term. The change is going to be a while. So, and like we already said, we have this momentum right now. What things are you thinking about enacting in order to make sure that this is sustained and not just a moment? So for instance, we're really looking at partnerships. We're looking at issues of gentrification and how do we still access those communities that may not be in Oakland, or like in the areas of Oakland that we have traditionally worked in, and making those moves towards those new areas. So what are y'all thinking in terms of long term, or what are you thinking in terms of like how we sustain this moment and keep it going? I will call on you like a teacher.
Well, one conversation I had with Brian, the CEO, when this was all happening last year was, I told him, like, look, we're really concerned that this is just sort of the flavor of the week, and you're very committed right now and your heart's in the right place, but I'm worried that your attention will be pulled in another direction, and then this will be news of the past. And so what I asked for was really that he make a public commitment, or he make public commitments. And I think that's one way that we hold our leaders accountable, is like, tell the public what you're going to do, and ideally be aggressive and ambitious in what you're trying to deliver on. And I mean, this eventually happened. I'm not saying I did this by myself. Obviously, it wasn't the only one who had this idea, right? So, I think especially our diversity and our head of diversity and belonging, hey Melissa, did a lot of work to make sure that he would actually come out with these public commitments. And so, but I think that this can happen on a number of levels and a number of dimensions, depending on what your organization is. But if you want them to be held accountable, what better way to do that than to tell everybody out in the world of what you're planning to do, so that they can follow up and make sure you're going to actually make it happen.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the, like Simone is saying, the uh, the recognition, the level of commitment. I think it's also a question of leadership too. I know one of the things at the library that's a positive is that we have our the director of the library is a member of the racial equity team. So that's a really positive because every meeting, you know, whatever information we're sharing, discussing, deciding upon that can be helpful in towards developing policies that are anti-racist, that there's someone there who is at the forefront of being able to make change.
Um, I am gonna, because we have some questions from the audience. Some of them are for specific folks, but I also think they can apply to anyone. So feel free to jump in if you have a response. But I have a question for Johan. Can you give a specific example of how the library uses a racial equity lens in developing programming?
I think it's something that we're in the process of working on, collaborating with the racial equity plan. We have these ideas of ways to promote programming related to a racial equity lens. And I think the key parts are to work with programming that already is doing wonderful work. There's quite a few of them that I could mention that are doing great work. And if we could, I guess, just promote it, have discussions about ways that we can make sure that it's focused on the racial equity lens. I think those are the things that we can do, um, in a prioritized fashion, realistically, pragmatically. And then there's other issues around more challenging issues, like I guess just kind of connecting with all the communities in ways that they're interested in seeing a racial equity lens become a part of our programming in the years to come.
Um, does anybody else want to respond to that in terms of how you use a racial equity lens? Okay. So I have a question for our folks from SF Jazz. People are wondering, how has anti-Blackness manifested itself at SF Jazz, and what does an anti-racist workplace look like?
Greg, you want to start and I'll jump
I'll
in?
start. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
How has anti-blackness manifested itself at SF Jazz? I would say, first of all, I would say we are collecting the data right now, so I don't have a complete answer. That literally is in process. Um, what I can tell you is there is a common thread in exit interviews, and this is among anybody who leads the organization, and that is about voice, and that is about being heard, and that is among white people and people of color. And what what I recognize and is important culturally to be understood is that in and of itself, we are an equal opportunity offender by not listening. However, by not listening to the BIPOC people who state that in their exit interviews, that is building on years of marginalization and therefore is a racist act. It's a culturally racist, not policy, but practice. And that is what needs to change. So even if we can justify it and say, well, no, we need to improve our listening skills for everybody. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But when it builds on years of behavior that is both institutional, organizational, and societal, that again makes us have to have a special um, responsibility to counter that and to be much more mindful of that. What does an anti-racist organization look like at SF Jazz? It allows for voice at all levels. It allows for voice from all people and ensures that those voices are heard. It provides far greater representation, as I mentioned before, at all levels of staff, leadership, board, audiences. Um, and when I say representation, I'm talking about a range of diversity and a range of voices and a culture that ensures that those voices are heard. It ensures a pay equity analysis that provides for fair compensation um, for the work that is being done, regardless of gender, regardless of race. And I do want to emphasize again um, the need for diversity of audiences, which is critical among all arts organizations and cultural organizations, is especially important for us because of the work that we present. And again, I think the responsibility for us to use our stage and our platform to do the right thing, to convey the right message, to convey the need for and advance the idea of equity through music and through spoken word and through the art that we present.
I wouldn't add much to that, but thank you, Greg. I would just say really centering those voices and also doing it with a tremendous amount of love and empathy, because we are talking about systemic hierarchical power structures that have been in existence in the organization since its inception. And now it's an opportunity to address those and redress them. So I think this is a journey that we are embarking on and doing so with great vigor. But I know it will be a challenge to see it happen quickly. And I'm very much looking forward to participating in the process, knowing that we will be sitting with some very uncomfortable conversations with folks, but this is something that we're all prepared to do.
Um, this question is, I'm gonna, it's from Sarah, but I'm also gonna add another component to it. What hiring practices are your organizations using to promote diversity at all levels? And then I also just, when like in terms of your leadership, how does your leadership reflect both the people that you work who work in your organization, but also the people that your organization represents. So, you know, consumers, kids who come to the library, your audience. So what hiring practices are you using to promote diversity? And then also in terms of your leadership, you know, who's making the decisions and how does that relate to your audience?
I know at Pixar, there's a lot of things that have been happening, starting with just the website. You know, all the websites have pictures of like, look at us, we're drawing things, we're making movies. But who's in there? Does everyone see themselves? Are there women? Are there people of color? And are there different age ranges, abilities? So that it seems like a small thing, but I think when you see yourself reflected just in the images of the company, I think that goes a long way. A lot of attention has been placed in the language that we use in the job postings. I think traditionally the language that's used is very skewed towards like empowering white males. And I think we're trying to make sure that we're using language that doesn't necessarily promote things that we traditionally associate with just that group. But we're also I was involved in the debiasing of a particular type of hiring and promoting. Like, where are the opportunities for that bias to creep in? And you're never going to completely remove bias from hiring, but like you have to take a look at the questions, and the questions that you ask have to really be tied to the qualifications that you're looking for the people in this job. So it's less about interview skills. It's less about like, I really had a great conversation with that person. We went to the same school. We have the same upbringing. And it's much more about like, what have they proven that they've done in the past? And how does that apply to the job that we're actually hiring for? And those are just some of the things that we've been kind of taking a look at. And yes, I see the culture add over culture fit. Exactly. Additive, not like just someone else that fits the mold that we're kind of seeing. Thank you for that comment. I forgot the second part of your question, but maybe someone else can answer
how
that.
does leadership reflect the audience that you serve or your workforce?
I think that's one of the tough parts that we're looking into. You know, it's heavily white, it's heavily male, and it's like, all right, that's one of our challenges. How do we kind of create space for a more diverse leadership? And I'm talking like kind of really higher up. I think we're making strides in entry level and mid level. And the next step is kind of looking towards how do we infuse more diversity at the top levels and not just for diversity jobs.
Anyone else want to talk about hiring practices? I know this is also a weird time to talk about hiring because most people, our budgets are frozen, everybody's at home. So. Johan.
I did want to say, in terms of the library, that the racial equity team, that on our racial equity team, we have the director also of human resources, the human resources director also sits on our library team. So we have that as a resource, and the director of the library too. So, and we're also kind of going through a pretty extensive process right now of looking at all those jobs posting, job specification processes too, and making sure, like Jesus was saying, that, or like the also the post, the chat said too, that it's about the pragmatic fit as opposed to any other type of fit. I guess the challenge in that is that we are just one department in a citywide bureaucratic structure. So that process does take time, but my sense is that there's a commitment, ongoing commitment that exists currently.
Right. We have a question from Marcus. How are you measuring your diversity, equity, and inclusion programs? Primarily interested in the measurement around equity and inclusion. And I just want to go back to Simone's point of like, I think it is very easy to measure by numbers, but how are we also measuring what folks are bringing, representing, adding, not just adding numbers, but like how are their voices being incorporated and how is that being looked at?
I'll jump in. One of my first priorities with the expansion of the education program at SF Jazz was ensuring that we have a much more representative group of teaching artists and educators on our department. So hiring practices for me began with making sure that I had my POC folks represented in our team and in our classrooms and in front of students. And now we're embarking on measures of, again, this transformation of our pedagogy, and that's being led by our team of teaching artists. And each teaching artist leads a cohort of other teaching artists who work together in
framing our residency programs in middle schools and public middle schools, which is our primary demographic that we serve in public schools in San Francisco and Oakland. So this is an example of something that we had to be really intentional about, because prior to that, we had these programs that we had always historically done, and we delivered to different schools. And suddenly we were faced with the opportunity to transform our pedagogy and even the conversations around how we deliver this content in the midst of a pandemic with so many societal inequities, students who didn't have access to the internet, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a dramatic change for us, because we have been, I came in and adopted the same kind of modality as my predecessors, very much a hierarchy, a top-down kind of decision-making. And suddenly we are now skewing in a different direction. And that's just one example of, I think, how we're measuring the sort of equity lens in our work, and in particular anti-racist conversations and actions that we're taking in reframing just what we deliver and how we deliver it.
Anyone else? Sorry. I do get that. Like, we're all some of us are in the very much new phases, so we're not quite measuring things yet. This question came in via email, and it's for SF Jazz, but I think this is something that we did with our anti-racism task force, is we talked about our own personal, where we're coming from, whether it be race, gender, our color, all that kind of thing. So this is for SF Jazz, but it can also apply to anybody. How do your identities and leadership positions advance or obstruct the racial justice work that's being done at your organization? So I know, like, I as a program manager at Destiny, as someone who influences the programming and the way it's conducted, like, my personal identity as a Black woman is really important and informs how I do my work. So how does your personal identity inform how you do the work, and maybe how does that obstruct or advance the work that you're doing?
Greg, you want to go first?
I'll give it a shot. It's a really interesting question that I haven't necessarily considered before. I would like to think that, well, first of all, I don't consider my personal identity is not defined or born around my color or gender, but obviously that has a significant influence on my life experience. I am a white male leading an organization that presents Black American music. I recognize that. I am, and hopefully you've heard from some of the things I've said, as I said, I'm new to the position, yet I am 100% committed to the cultural transformation that is required around equity. I would hope, if anything, the privilege that I have in serving this organization and being in this position helps me advance the agenda that I think is really important around equity. And I would like to take advantage of and leverage that privilege to move this action forward, not just the conversation. And there are things that we can do in the short term, as you had said, and there are things that will take longer, whether it's because, yeah, budgets are frozen, we're not hiring right now, we've lost a substantial part of our income, our revenue, et cetera. But we can still create plans such that when we are back to presentation again, we're able to implement those plans. I am committed to change. I am enacting change. I am listening to all voices. And if anything, I think that my identity is either irrelevant to that or might allow me to accelerate that. I will say, just because of my own work which preceded this job, there is a spectrum of awareness and appreciation, particularly among my demographic, in where the United States is, where the world is in racial equity. And to move ahead of that spectrum, you need to listen to voices, you need to read, you need to inform yourself, particularly if you are not living it, as Sana, you might be, and many others are. I am not living that. I'm not personally experiencing it. All I can do is be open to listening and committed to educating myself. Now, I have a lot to learn. I have learned a lot in the 8 months that I've been on this job, but I had been committed to that journey prior through work that I've done in my previous career in attempting to promote diversity and equity. So in that spectrum, I'm not all the way through. I've got a lot of work I need to do, but I have some progress that was already made. And in my 8 months in this job, I feel that I've learned a tremendous amount by listening to a range of voices, including and perhaps especially the committee, which I already talked about at SFJazz. So it's a really difficult question to answer. It's not one that I've necessarily considered. I would hope that if anything, I can leverage the privilege to enact change more aggressively.
I wouldn't add much to that, but I would just say, from my own experience, as a Latinx woman, and usually in a space that's largely dominated by white male and female directors, it has been a challenge to find and make my space in that role. And in the 10 years I've been at SFJazz, I've navigated through some of those challenges and find right now that this is an interesting and defining moment for us. So I don't by any means think that we're even close to being there, whatever that there is. But I'm very keenly aware of the possibility and the position that I have and the power that I have as a director to make decisions, despite the fact that we are still very much in a white male centered kind of environment. So those are things that I'm always carrying with me. So anyway, I'll just end it with that.
One thing I wanted to say before I launch into my own piece, I think it's important to recognize that being a white person is also a specific racial experience. It may be considered as the default because it's the reference culture, it's the dominant culture, but your experience as a white person, Greg, is just as specific as is our experience as people of color. And so that means that comes with a particular lens and a particular understanding. And it's hard to separate that out, and develop an objective perspective because we all think, well, this is just reality and this is how life functions. But I just wanted to note that. I think that for me, the question of blackness is interesting because I grew up in Switzerland, and so I didn't grow up in the U.S. I don't have the same experience. The only black people that I basically knew was my family, and grew up in a largely white environment, and so personally, singularly, as an individual, I'm unapologetically Black and I'm not ashamed of my privilege, meaning that I am a light skinned woman, that I'm an attractive woman, that I grew up, economically protected and safe, that I have a good education, that I have a good job, all those things, right? It's happened and it's there and I use it for good. But when I lead a group of Black people, it's different because I make decisions on their behalf. I advocate for them. I represent them to a largely white audience, and so that I feel I need to make a distinction because I have a disproportionate amount of power and influence. I have a real opportunity, for better or for worse, to impact their experience at the company. And so, in that capacity, I have to communicate that I understand that there's a material difference between me and them. that I see the implications, that I will consider them. Because if I can't do that, then why should they trust me? Why should I, over anybody else, be chosen to speak for them? So I think that's the distinction between me as an individual and as someone who is leading a group of Black people.
Yeah, I wanted to just add too that on the racial equity team, we have um, members of a variety of different ethnicities and backgrounds. We have several uh, white members, and they are really committed as well to being allies in the fight to eliminate institutional racism. And I think that one of the things I'm interested in hopefully doing in the next year or so is um, playing a role in gathering together people of color in a caucus group. And then one of my colleagues might have who's a Caucasian or white might have a chance to do that as well in a way that um, that the people of color, this whole idea of caucusing is that we would address internalized racial oppression, and then the white caucus group might address issues around let's see what's the term. I think there's a term for it which I'm forgetting at the moment, but I think it's institutional racial oppression. And so I just wanted to say that, Greg, that it's really critical to have allies in the fight to eliminate institutional racism. And also, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
All right. We have one last question from the audience. This is from Susan on Facebook. I believe so much of the deep work needed to genuinely create more equitable and inclusive organizations. I believe so much of the deep work needed to genuinely create more equitable and inclusive organizations comes from needing to work with communities. What are some of the ways in which you're working with community organizations to build authentic partnerships that lead to deep change?
I'll jump in. Partnership is probably one of the most critical aspects of SF Jazz outreach initiatives. And while in the past we may have had some somewhat superficial relationships with partners, or meaningful ones that weren't sustainable, or that were contingent on funding that was inconsistent. Several years ago, I had a conversation with a wonderful colleague of mine, Angela Wellman, who runs the Oakland Public Conservatory, one of the longest running public conservatories in the Bay Area, and specifically in Oakland. And, she confronted me directly. She said, Rebecca, what are we going to do about this situation? Speaking to jazz education inequities. And we formed a partnership that now is in its 5th year between our two organizations, specifically looking at the resources that SF Jazz can bring into the community to support students in their own communities learning about jazz. There was always this notion that we want to bring more diverse audiences to SF Jazz. And yes, that is a goal. That is a stated goal in terms of our audience development and all those sorts of things. But it was also equally important to bring the resources into those community spaces. And so that is one of the partnerships of which I'm the most proud, because it is something that really is two organizations coming together with different aesthetics, different values, but one common goal, and that is to serve students who are in need of more resources and bring those resources to them and provide that level of excellence, artistic and creative excellence in the communities in which students live. So that's just an example of one of our partnerships that we've done.
I wanted to highlight that one of the things that Destiny has been doing, that our program director is spearheading, is us also taking our programming into areas that we haven't before, specifically like juvenile halls, homeless shelters, like really in community, and partnering with organizations who have deep relationships with those communities already. I think that in order, rather than just going into places and saying, we have this thing that's awesome, finding the people who are already there is so important. And I think it's something that as we continue to build partnerships, it's something we've done in the past, but as we continue to build partnerships with new communities, we're always looking for the organization that is already there doing the work and that we can add value to.
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head of, like, I think what organizations normally do is, hey, we're awesome, we're here, here's this thing, and you might not need that thing, you might not want that thing. What do I do with this thing? So it's so important to really, to form a real lasting partnership, is kind of an understanding of what you can offer and what are the needs, and how do you insert yourself into the community in a way that doesn't feel like you're dictating the terms or you're dictating the agenda. So that's something that I hope, Shanna, we're trying to do with Destiny. We're working hard little by little, but and I think that's something that I've seen at Pixar to be something that's been approached very mindfully. And with certain organizations, we certainly donate to a lot of organizations. But I think for the ones that we're trying to really cultivate in Oakland and the Bay Area at large, that's something that we're constantly thinking about and kind of considering as we kind of reach out to communities.
Right. There's one last question from the audience. What accountability processes have you found to be effective in order to tackle behaviors of discrimination or prejudice amongst your employees or with young people, if you work with young people? Have you used meditation, restorative justice? What kind of HR practices? And are those happening in-house or by dedicated specialists, external specialists? Again, just speaking from Destiny's perspective, we do use a restorative justice circle model for any mediation that happens with our young people. And in terms of like internally, I am a person who speaks my mind, and I'm very direct, so I will go to the person directly and work it out. But I think one thing that we have found is, we are not perfect, and sometimes we do need to call in folks to take care of things, just because we do believe in, we don't want to push people out of the community. We want to bring them back into the community in a way that's healthy. So anybody can answer that. What accountability processes have you found to be effective? Johan, are you thinking or?
I'm thinking, but one of the conversations we've had, because we have a lot of young people who come into our branch, is I guess the idea of separating behavior or separating the action from the behavior. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but I hope you guys know what I mean. But I think, like if there's a situation that occurs and it leads to the young person having to leave the library for that day, just saying, okay, well, you have to leave today, but we welcome you back tomorrow. So it's just not separating the behavior from the actions in a way. Yeah.
I would echo that. Part of the trauma-informed practices that we have implemented in our education praxis is precisely that, is understanding that any kind of disruptive behavior among students is, something that is a result of some trauma that student is experiencing. So how can we mitigate that and not make the behavior, not create a punitive disruption to their learning, because it is through this process of giving them this gift of education, of jazz, of whatever it is we're bringing, that we're going to help them deal with those traumas. And so not only are we providing this resource to our teaching artists, but also to the education staff, so that we can really have conversations, intentional conversations around how we can be more mindful in our own practices and our meetings, in the ways that we interact with one another. So like Shauna, what you said, some people have that direct style, very upfront, and some of us are conflict avoidant. And so even being able to acknowledge and recognize how each of us as individuals manages trauma or conflict, these are some of the things that we've had to implement in order to strengthen our internal dynamic and our collaborative practice.
Yeah, I want to add, I think in an organization like ours, like we do have a HR department that kind of everything gets funneled there, and there's obviously some privacy stuff that needs to be acknowledged. But I think what I wanted to add to the conversation is just making sure that you're creating the safe spaces for people to come forward and share their experience. I think that's the step one. I think that's where a lot of stuff doesn't get reported. If you don't have the culture where people feel comfortable enough to kind of approach the right measures or the right steps to kind of bring issues up. So that I just want to kind of add that's like the biggest thing. If people don't come forward, then people aren't going to think there's a problem.
I would say that fundamentally you have to set up the systems and the processes for you to be able to enforce any kind of accountability. So I think it's one thing to have a sort of like a restorative justice model. I think that makes sense with young people. And I think it makes sense if you're in a capacity of like teaching. But I think when you're dealing with full-fledged adults, whether they're there, developmentally or not, you have to have the systems and the processes set up to be able to follow through on what you say your values are as an institution. And so I think it's just about being thoughtful of what that looks like. There's obviously, HR and talent best practices, but what does that look like in your organization if this is something that you really value? Like Jesus was saying, like, how do you create safe spaces? How do you make sure people have the information? How do you make sure that the process for evaluating and assessing complaints is fair and equitable and not biased? So I think there's the piece around thought leadership, and there's a piece around like how do you remedy the injury in the moment, but then also what are you creating in terms of structure to make sure you can follow through on the values that you say as you have as an organization.
My final closing question, and I would hope this applies to all of our panelists, is personally, why is this work important and meaningful to you? So just, personally, why do you do the work of advancing equity?
I could jump in. My background is my family's from Mexico. I'm a gay man. I grew up in the south side of Chicago in maybe not what people would consider a great neighborhood. And for me, it stems from there. It stems from my childhood of, I was privileged in many ways, and I got the opportunities that I got, but I thought everyone else was going to be able to come up with me. I didn't see myself as better than anyone else, and I didn't see myself as smarter or harder working. But as you start to progress in life, you realize that there's a lot more obstacles that other people have that I could have had, but for whatever reason I didn't. And as you start to progress in my particular career, that the spaces have gotten less and less diverse. And I found myself kind of shrinking a little bit more each time I moved up. And then finally realizing that, like, no, my perspective matters, and everything that I went through, even though no one might relate to it, is valuable and is important to share, because there might be someone else out there that's staying quiet, that you can empower through your own story and through just speaking up on behalf of yourself or on behalf of others. So that's why it's personal. I think a lot about the kids I went to school with, and how different some of our lives have turned out. And not to say one's better than the other, but it touches me in a way that, like, it just hits me in a different way, that, like, the opportunities were not equally distributed, or we weren't playing on the same playing field. And that is something that I have committed myself to trying to fix, even though it probably won't happen completely in my lifetime, but let's nudge it a little bit forward.
I would say two things. First, it's the right thing to do. Inarguably, it is the right thing to do. And second, for someone like me, it is my responsibility to leverage the privilege to do that right thing. I think it's as simple and as complicated as that.
For me, it's offering and operating from a position of solidarity and love. I'm a musician first and foremost, and always been in the spirit of collaboration, working with others to create something of beauty. And so extending that into this more sort of executive role is a natural extension of what I've always done all my life as an artist. Although my style might not be as authoritative as I'd like it to be, I'd like to be a little bit more emphatic in my ability to move this forward. I always am coming from a place of healer, solidarity, doing it out of great empathy and love for my colleagues and for the students and for the art form.
Johan?
Yeah, I think for myself, just being a Black man growing up in America, that I guess I feel like I've been fortunate to have experiences that have been positive and life affirming, and I want to do what I can to share those with others. And I feel, yeah, just very fortunate that a lot of the things that I've experienced in life, um, kind of like what Jesus was saying, that they, may not be the things that everyone has an opportunity to experience. And the more that I can share uh, and have empathy towards others, um, and like Rebecca was saying, just focusing on the positive, it just allows me to move forward and be a contributor to our society.
Simone?
So I've never really fit in anywhere, and it's not the tragic light skin story. It's more of a like growing up on two continents and two cultural identities. And so I think I'm also just kind of just the way my brain works. I just don't quite fit. And so I didn't really find my purpose or a sense of belonging until it was really in service of other people, and more specifically in service of young people. I feel like that's where I really felt like the greatest alignment is that if I can be a resource to them in a way that I didn't have to navigate some really difficult sort of emotional um, situations and questions around who I am and what I'm about. And so I feel I have a pact with the universe. I'm out here doing good, and in return, it will look out for me and it will spare me any super terrible situations, hopefully, in life. But also, I just think that like my accomplishments, my money, my power, my anything that I, experience in terms of personal success, if I'm not using that to remove obstacles and open doors for other people, then what is it all for? It's really no point. So I feel very comfortable with this idea that like I am going to pay forward whatever I receive in turn to those who have less access and less opportunity than I do.
I think similarly, I mean, in the words of Issa Rae, I'm rooting for everybody Black. And I think in the past, for me, a lot of the work that I did was about making sure kids have access, making sure kids get to experience all of the things that I got to experience because of my opportunities. And now, you know, that I find myself like somewhat in a leadership position, you know, I'm trying to make sure my people get paid. I'm trying to make sure that young people get paid for the work and the value that they add. I'm trying to make sure that teaching artists, particularly teaching artists of color, get paid for the value that they add to society. They're educators, they're artists. I'm trying to make sure that people are able to create without boundaries and without obstacles. Um, and I feel like that's, you know, when we talk about doing this work, a lot of this work is about changing policies so people have the opportunity to do that. And to do that and to bring their full selves to the work that they do. So I just want to appreciate all of you for being here this evening. We're running a little bit over, but you know, the conversation dictated that. Before we go, I just want to remind people that Destiny Arts Center is open virtually, and our registration is open until this Friday. So please come move with us. Also, our next Creating Connections panel is going to happen on March 10th, and that will be hosted by our Destiny Arts Youth Performance Company. So they will be showing you a little bit of what they've been doing and working on. We also now have a TeePublic store. So if you want to get some Destiny swag, you can go to teepublic.com/user/destiny-arts-center. And we have some new designs in the store. So please check that out. And before we go, we're going to end things like we do at Destiny, with the fist in the middle. So if I can get all my panelists, put your fist towards the screen, and unmute yourselves on the count of 3. We're going to say the word action. 1, 2, 3.
Action.
Thank you so much for being panelists this evening. Thank you so much for joining us on Facebook and on Zoom, in the chat, and we will see you back here on March 10th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, that was very enjoyable.
Be well.
You too.